The RMT have announced 8 days of strikes over Christmas and the New Year, which is set to grind the railway network to a halt. 40,000 workers are expected to walk out in the latest escalation of their long-running dispute with 14 train operating companies and Network Rail. The demands of the union concern pay, conditions and job security. Now, the right-wing press are using the strikes as a chance to try and demonise rail workers. The Sun reported on the development like this: Union boss Mick is Grinch, how the Lynch stole Christmas. And then you've got a sort of picture of Mick Lynch mocked up as the Grinch, or characteristically subtle from the Sun. And then the Metro have sort of followed that lead. The Metro have It's Mick Grinch, although you can see they have a sort of cheaper graphic design department than the Sun have. Speaking to Good Morning Britain, though, Mick Lynch said it was the government, not the union, who were responsible for any disruption.
How much longer is this going to drag on for?
Well, I hope it can be terminated quickly for a resolution with the employers. But the problem at the moment is the Department of Transport and the Secretary of State are blocking the deal. We were in negotiations intensively after we suspended the last action. And I was told by the Rail Delivery Group, which is the coordinating group, that a deal would be put on the table on Monday.
This Monday gone?
This Monday this week. And with 55 minutes to go, they phoned me up and said, that meeting is cancelled. We don't want you at the meeting and we're not going to make you an offer. We are not allowed to make an offer. And the only people that can veto that are the government.
The government are flatly denying this. They are flatly denying, explicitly denying, sticking their spoke into this particular wheel. They say it is absolutely a matter between you guys and the employers. Are they lying?
Yes, they are. Because in the passenger service contracts, it's explicit, and you can look it up, that the Secretary of State is responsible for industrial relations and he is responsible for their negotiating mandate. The chief person from the Rail Delivery Group, the chairman, said, I will make you an offer. He phoned me personally on Saturday morning. Come to my office at 2 o'clock on Monday. I will make you an offer in writing. At 1 o'clock on that day, he said, they're not allowing me to make that offer. Now, people can believe that or not, but it's in those contracts which are in the public domain. He is directly responsible and they have to carry out his instructions.
So you're accusing the government of a barefaced lie on this?
I am, yes.
And you're aiming that at the Transport Secretary?
Yeah, and I'll be telling him that tomorrow morning when I meet him. He's responsible for industrial relations. That's his legal responsibility in this country. He directs those companies and he's the only shareholder of Network Rail.
What is the current deal?
Well, we haven't got an offer at all for the train operating companies. There's no offer in writing. They've put nothing down on a piece of paper. We've shared lots of whiteboard stuff and lots of stuff on screen, but they have not written to us to make us an offer on pay, the conditions that they want to change, modernisation. They've not written that down for us to consider, and there's nothing on job security.
So according to Mick Lynch, it's the government that are preventing any resolution to the current dispute. And in a separate interview, he explained how the government are enabling the rail companies to remain profitable even as strikes continue.
I calculate that for every striker, the railway industry has lost £5,000. That's a lot of money to be taken out of the industry.
Well, it's not being taken out of the industry. The company is dumping taxpayers' money back into the accounts of the train operating companies. They have indemnified them for every strike we've taken. And the train operating companies themselves have suffered no losses whatsoever. So the money's not leaving in the industry in any sense that you might describe, Simon. A cheque is being written by Mark Harper, by Grant Shapps and whoever came in between, if you can remember those people. They have written cheques directly to Steve Montgomery and Andy Meadows, who I face at the table, and Abellio and First Group and Go Ahead Group, pocket that money and lose no money whatsoever when we're on strike. So the questions have got to be asked the other way round. We're not taking the money out of the industry. We give up our wages. They don't give up their dividends or their profits. They're indemnified for every loss that is incurred.
So that's pretty remarkable. Trade unionists are losing their wages when they go on strike, but the rail companies are having any lost profits compensated. The government's hope is clearly that if they protect the bosses but not the workers, they can help the bosses win. Of course, as we're talking about Mick Lynch, it wasn't just the government that got a kicking in his round of interviews. Media elites had a hard time too. Here he is on Good Morning Britain again.
Let's just tell it like it is. It doesn't really matter to you what the British public thinks about this. It has no bearing on your ability to...
Does.
Well, in what way? Because you're disrupting them enormously at Christmas. So you clearly, at bottom, you can't afford to care what they think, otherwise that would stay your hand in terms of the... Well,
we're not cynical people. Our members live in these communities. They're ordinary working men and women. They don't get paid when they're on strike, and they make a sacrifice in order to defend their terms and conditions. Across this economy, people have had their terms and conditions, included in this studio, ripped to pieces and are on precarious work values, right? They don't get contracts of employment, they don't get holiday pay, they don't get sick pay, they don't get loads of other benefits that you used to get because they're all being made to work on casual employment basis.
All right.
That's what's happening in this economy, and that's what we're defending. And most workers in this country want to see a restoration of that job security and decent terms and conditions.
That's a very smart answer. I thought when I first saw that, I thought, what? Is there some controversy about the Good Morning Britain staff that I'm not aware of? Have they had some big dispute that he was sort of cheekily referring to there? As far as I understand it, there isn't a big public Good Morning Britain dispute going on. But I think the point of that answer was essentially to say, look, Richard Madeley, Susanna Reid, you're coming across quite hostile towards workers fighting for their rights. Now, maybe it's difficult for you to relate because you're on very high incomes and people at the top of the tree often have pretty good terms and conditions. But maybe the other people in the studio, the people who aren't interviewing me, but the people who book guests, the people who clean the studio, the people who manage the cameras, maybe these people can relate to us a bit better because the TV industry, like almost every industry, is now filled with casualized workers who aren't getting paid enough. Now, as I say, once you get to the top, if you get to the top of the rail industry, they're also very much treated well, both in terms of pay and both in terms of conditions. But in all other parts of most industries, they're not. And I think that's one of the things that Mick Lynch is very good at communicating.
God, Mick Lynch is good, isn't he? Like, I feel like a counter propaganda to this should be like, we should rebrand him as Saint Nicholas. Like, if you're going to call him the Grinch, it's like, actually, he's saving Christmas for the workers. But anyway, this is why I'm not in comms. But this is like an incredibly classic anti-union strategy, because what the whole like Mick Grinch, ruining Christmas thing, it's essentially just about pitting workers against one another, because the vast majority of people who read newspapers are going to be people whose working conditions and whose economic conditions should have a lot more in common with striking rail workers than with the editors of The Sun or the editors of the Daily Mail. And so what they're trying to do there, by using these like emotive language, this hysterical language, and pinning the blame for all of this failure on Mick Lynch and on the unions. It's trying to pit the workers that read the paper against the workers that are going on strike, and trying to prevent any idea that they might have that actually they could look at what's happening in the rail sector and think, maybe I should be doing this in my industry. And it's also obviously about pitting workers against the entire union movement. And, the way that you do that is not only by this kind of ridiculous caricaturing, but you do it by, and we saw it there when Mick Lynch was talking about essentially that the government, his suspicion that the government vetoes the ability for a deal to actually go through. That is a clear attempt to essentially engineer failure through refusal of negotiation, and engineer a kind of failure that will be felt very tangibly, not by bosses whose profits are protected, but by the people who use rail services, by other workers. And by heightening that effect and making that effect feel really tangible by deliberately refusing a deal, you then kind of create a situation where people blame their hardships on the union movement and blame their hardships on striking workers. And you're able to then paint the unions as not being in the interest of working class people, as being, selfish or politically motivated or whatever, as if, the Conservative government aren't politically motivated. That kind of strategy is very much key to the birth of neoliberalism. Under post-war capitalism, you did have this, at least this theory that, there was a negotiation between capital and labor. Obviously, more often than not, it wasn't a real negotiation, but at least that was kind of the ideological framework in which we were operating. The fact that you didn't have as many laws, that you didn't have as many anti-union laws, for example, under the post-war period as you do now. It was very much this theoretical idea that capital and labor would negotiate with one another and would arrive to deals, and that's how, you know, the kind of pact between the two would remain stable. Whereas neoliberalism was very much about actually completely destroying the labor movement rather than just trying to overpower the labor movement in those negotiations. It was very much about destroying the very concept of a labor movement. That was, you know, key to Thatcher's legacy. That was Thatcher's strategy, was to allow and engineer a consistent sense of infrastructural failure, which can then be blamed on the unions and lead to, you know, mass exodus from the unions, etc. And that's what we're seeing happening here, you know, by preventing a successful negotiation where workers can come to and bosses can kind of come to an agreement to something that they can both live with, and we all kind of can move on with our lives. That's not the goal here. The goal here is to create a kind of failure that can be weaponized into divisive rhetoric and into an overall disillusionment with organized labor, with a union movement. And that is very much the kind of long game that the Conservative Party, that the government are playing here, that goes that the impacts of which are much bigger and go much further than this particular dispute in the rail industry. But it's actually an attempt to curtail the possibility that budding and growing labor organizing across lots of different sectors will actually happen. It's an attempt to stave off what is looking to be a few years of ramped up labor organizing. And I think that is really what this is about here. And the rail workers are simply seen as a kind of sacrificial lamb in that broader struggle against an organized labor movement across different sectors. Because obviously strike action, you know, the growth of the labor movement, it is happening. It is we are seeing industries that have never gone on strike before going on strike. Conservative Party, the establishment are aware of that, and it's very important to them that they win this ideological battle against the unions in order to prevent it getting out of their control.